We're going to continue our series today on great Bible events. So we're going to be in the book of Exodus, chapter 16. And we're going to talk about manna, God's bread from heaven. The story of a man named John Brent. He was a friend of Luther during the Reformation period, and he was one of the stalwarts of the Reformation period. And he angered some people high up in power in the Spanish government, Charles V. And Charles V made several attempts to kill this minister. And when he had heard that the troops of the Spanish cavalry were on their way to arrest him, he got down on his knees and he prayed to God, and he got some guidance. The guidance from God came to him and said, "Take a loaf of bread and go into the upper town, and where thou findest a door open, enter and hide thyself under the roof." So he acted accordingly. He went uptown, he found an open door, went there and hid himself in the loft. And for 14 days he stayed up there. Now for 14 days, one loaf of bread probably wouldn't have been enough food. But every single day, a little hen would come up quietly, without making a noise, peep or sound, and lay one egg every day, right there in that rooftop, right where he hid himself. So when he relied on what the Lord had told him to do, and followed the Lord's leading and the prompting of the Spirit to his heart, the Lord took care of him. So we're going to look at the Lord taking care of us. Ephesians 3:20 tells us, "Now unto him that is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think, according to the power that worketh in us." When we want to think about God taking care of us, this is a good verse to build up upon. And you take it in its little parts and pieces, and it's a building block, and it gets bigger and bigger. First of all, we ask. Not just what we ask, but all that we ask. And not even just that. Not even just all that we ask, but above all that we ask or think. And not just above it, but abundantly above all that we ask or think. And not even just abundantly, but exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. And it's wonderful and great to think about all this, but what's most important, what we cannot forget, is the beginning of that it says He is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think. The Lord can take care of us in so many different ways. We find in this story the Israelite nation wandering in the wilderness. They hadn't been gone from Egypt for very long. It may seem like a long time to some of us when we're away from home that long or on a journey. But when you look at it in the picture of the 40 years they wandered the desert, they hadn't been gone that long, and they started to run out of food. So they get provided some manna from heaven. Now what exactly is manna? Well, the name of it is derived from man, or an expression of surprise, and then on, which is to allot or to give a gift. So it's a surprise gift from God. The manna of the bread. Now this was what they known as bread, but it was capable of being baked. You could boil it, you could grind it up in the mill, you could do all kinds of different things with this, and I'm sure those of us that have seen how many different ways there are to make a potato, it's kind of the same thing. It's a very versatile kind of food. You can just do whatever you want to do with it and make all kinds of different things. And it was very sustaining. It's a very sustaining type of food. It had all the nutrients they needed. It provided them with all the substance they needed. And it sustained them for the whole 40 years that they were wandering the wilderness. Now, I guess if I had to pick one thing that I could eat for 40 years, I guess I'd want it to be whatever God provided. Because it had to taste good. But it sustained them for the full 40 years they were there. And when we look at this story, we look at the enormity of everything that the people needed. It says in verse 1 of chapter 16, "And they took their journey from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came unto the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, on the 15th day of the second month after their departing out of the land of Egypt." So they wandered into the wilderness of Sin, which is a barren desert place. They weren't going to find a whole lot of food or substance in this place. It was not like they were going to be going and gathering berries or hunting down deer roaming around. It wasn't to be found. So there was this enormous need. When we think of the enormity of the amount of people that were going along with this group, this was not just a simple, family going on a vacation somewhere. This was a whole nation traveling together. Hundreds of thousands, million people wandering the wilderness, and all of them had to be fed. Where are you going to find enough food to feed this many people? If they were to rely on their own skill, their own ability to go out and gather and to hunt, there would have been no hope to have ever been able to feed that many people. So what, of course, did the Israelite people do when they found themselves in such a situation? We like to look back on these, and sometimes we like to point fingers and say, look at those silly Israelite people grumbling and moaning again. But I think sometimes if we reflect into our own lives, we can find ourselves grumbling and moaning in certain situations as well. But they started to complain, first of all, against Moses. Verse 2 says, "And the whole congregation of the children of Israel murmured against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness." Now, when we first start to point fingers at those that lead us, that tends to be the first place we like to look to blame. And when that doesn't get us anywhere and doesn't get us what we want, then sometimes we point our fingers towards God. And we try to blame Him, which is exactly what the Israelite people had done. In verse 7 it said, "And in the morning then ye shall see the glory of the Lord, for that He heareth your murmurings against the Lord. And what are we that ye murmur against us?" They pointed a finger at Moses, and it didn't get him anywhere. So they blamed God. Moses had told them, "Well, God told me to lead you out." So they're going to blame God. "God, why the heck did you take us here? Why would you lead us into the wilderness just so that we would perish from hunger? What was the purpose in that? Why would you do such a thing?" And they were murmuring and just complaining, constant complaining about, we need water, we need food, we need this. And it's easy for us to sit back and look on that and say, how could they fall into such a state? But whenever we do that, we should again reflect upon ourselves and say, do we ever find ourselves in a similar situation? Do we ever find ourselves when the chips are down, do we start to murmur and complain, even though we know the wonderful gifts that God has given to us? But even amongst this enormous need, and all this complaining, and all this murmuring, we see a greater grace poured out from God. God decided to rain down on them bread from heaven to take care of their need. Now, God didn't have to do that. We take back, and you don't have to flip back too far in Exodus to see when the Egyptian people wouldn't trust God or believe God, what was rained down on them? Fire, brimstone, and hail was rained down upon them. God could have simply brought a flood, He could have brought fire, He could have brought all kinds of judgment upon the people of Israel. But instead He chose to grace them. He chose grace and mercy, and He blessed them with bread from heaven. The Bible tells us that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So while they were yet murmuring against God Himself, God decided to bless them and provide for their every need. Because every blessing that's given to us from God, we don't deserve any of it. None of us deserve the grace and mercy God gives to us. But because Christ loved us, because God loved us, Only because of that do we have it offered to us. The same was true for the Israelite people as they were wandering in the wilderness. They hadn't done anything to deserve God feeding them. They hadn't done anything to deserve God giving them water. They hadn't done anything even to deserve God removing them from the bondage of Egypt. Nothing they had ever done had shown that they deserved that grace and mercy. But it was made so because God had promised it. God had promised that it would happen. And because He had said it would happen, it's going to happen. God will never lie. God can never lie. If God said it, it will come to pass. Now we look in this, and first of all, we had an enormous need. Then we had an enormous grace to fill that need. But it was filled so with an enormous abundance. More than was needed even. God provided above and beyond what they ever needed. In verse 16 it tells us, "This is the thing which the Lord hath commanded. Gather of it every man according to his eating, an omer for every man, according to the number of your persons. Take ye every man for them which are in his tents." And the children of Israel did so, and gathered some more, some less. And when they did meet it with an omer, he that gathered much had nothing over, and he that gathered little had no lack. They gathered every man according to his eating. It was like the all-you-can-eat buffet. Everyone got to come and enjoy God's all-you-can-eat buffet. Every man according to as much as he could eat, as much as he needed for his sustenance. God had provided it exactly as needed. An omer was about 2 quarts, so that every man took about 2 quarts. And that 2 quarts of this manna was sufficient to last them the whole day. He didn't say you had to go out in the morning and then back again at lunchtime and then back again in the evening time. He said you go out in the morning, you gather it. Gather what you need for the day, and that would be sufficient. And we see in here the picture of the bread raining down from heaven and gathered one time and is sufficient. Christ came down from heaven, and we gathered Him to ourselves one time, and His blood is sufficient. Christ is sufficient to fill every need that we ever had, and He has just enough for every one of us. You know, we as humans like to stack up someone's sin here, and their sin stack is this high, and mine may only be this high, and this one is this high. In God, sin is sin, and the blood of Christ is sufficient for no matter how high we as humans like to measure the stack of sin. God's blood is sufficient. Sufficient for the worst of sinners, for the vilest of sinners. It doesn't matter. It comes in abundance. The Lord's mercy and His grace is poured out upon us abundantly. And then we see there's a lot to be learned from this. Verses 19 through 29 tells us, "And Moses said, Let no man leave of it till the morning. Notwithstanding they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank, and Moses was wroth with them. And they gathered it every morning, every man according to his eating. And when the sun waxed hot, it melted. And it came to pass that on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said unto them, This is that which the Lord hath said, Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which ye will bake today, and seed that ye will seed, and that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. And they laid it up till the morning, as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. And Moses said, Eat that today, for today is a Sabbath unto the Lord. Today ye shall not find it in the field. 6 days ye shall gather it, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, in it there shall be none. And it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the 7th day for to gather, and they found none. And the Lord said unto Moses, How long refuse ye to keep my commandments and my laws? See for that the Lord hath given you the Sabbath, therefore He giveth you on the 6th day the bread of 2 days. Abide ye every man in his place, let no man go out of his place on the seventh day. First of all, it had to be gathered. They had to go out and get it. Christ provided for them, but they had to come to it. Christ provides us grace. He provides us His willing sacrifice on the cross. But we have to come to it. We have to go and accept it. It has to be gathered. And it has to be gathered. Not only did it have to be gathered, but if you look here in this story, it had to be gathered according to the way God said to do it. You couldn't depart from the way He had asked you to do it. He had a plan. He laid it out. He said, these are the rules upon which you will do it. You will get enough for you in one day, except for on the sixth. Then you'll get 2 days worth. And as long as they abide by those rules, and they did exactly what Moses told them that God had spoken to him, as long as they followed God's plan, everything went well. But when they departed from what God had told them, things didn't work out quite right. Things didn't go according to plan. And just the same is true for us when it comes to Christ, our bread of life. God has a plan. God has a way for us to gather Him to us. God has a way for us to get His grace and His mercy. And that is to place our faith and trust in Him. And as long as we do it by that plan, all will be well. But when we depart from that plan, when we try to add anything else to it, when we try to gather more than we should, when we try to hold it from other people, when we try to do anything else and add extra burdens upon it, it becomes of none effect. And the results are disastrous. We have to follow it according to God's plan. And again, it was all gathered, as He said, according to their need. When we come to Christ, we come with our need. Each and every one of us. That's why it's a personal thing. We all have our own individual needs. We all have our own individual sin. We all have our own individual faults. And we come to Christ and we gather Christ to us to cover our need. It's a personal thing. I can't gather enough. I can't gather more of Christ and then give Him to somebody else. That person has to go and gather Christ to himself as well. Each man gathering to his own self, according to their own need. Now the problem is, sometimes we have doubt. We read in here what happened when they went astray and went the wrong way. In verse 20 it said, notwithstanding they hearkened not unto Moses, but some of them left of it until the morning, and it bred worms and stank. And Moses was wroth with them. And 27 tells us, and it came to pass that there went out some of the people on the seventh day for to gather, and they found none. Some people didn't believe when Moses had told them God's plan. Some people didn't believe it. And they did other things. And we see, especially in verse 20, what happens when we don't believe God. It stinks. It smells. God cannot stand unbelief. And when we don't believe Him, it stinks in His nostrils. God wants a sweet-smelling savor raising up to Him, not the stink of unbelief. When we disbelieve God, things don't smell good, but when we disobey God, we also come to disappointment. Those that disobeyed and didn't gather enough on the sixth day, I guess they ended up not getting to eat on the seventh, because they disobeyed God. They were disappointed. I can only imagine, the disappointment of missing a day's worth of meals was a small lesson for these Israelite people to learn to teach us a much greater lesson. To understand the enormity of the disappointment of those that would go before God on the great judgment day without the grace of God in their hands, without the grace of God in their heart. Those that are gathering up works of righteousness to themselves. Imagine the enormity of the disappointment when they go before God and try to offer them to Him. Because when we stand before God and God says, what is it you have to offer me to enter into my kingdom? All we can say is, I have the blood of Jesus Christ to offer you. Nothing else. Nothing else. Everything else leads to disappointment because it is disobedient to God's Word. And then we can see, finally, the enormous care that God gave to His people. Verse 35 says, And the children of Israel did eat manna 40 years until they came to a land inhabited. They did eat manna until they came unto the borders of the land of Canaan. This same bread that had saved them in the first day when they were hungry had kept them for the entire time of their journey, the full 40 years. What a wonderful God we have that keeps and takes care of us in such a great way in every aspect of life. And it doesn't quit. It doesn't stop. It just keeps going. It just keeps coming. Every time we need it. Every time you need God's grace, He is there for you. All you need to do is ask. John chapter 6, verse 25. Starting in verse 25. Here we see a change from the bread, the manna, the bread from heaven, to the bread of life. And when they had found him on the other side of the sea, they said unto him, Rabbi, when camest thou hither? Jesus answered them and said, Verily, verily, I say unto you, ye seek me, not because ye saw the miracles, but because ye did eat of the loaves and were filled. Labor not for the meat which perisheth, but for that meat which endureth unto everlasting life, which the Son of Man shall give unto you. For him hath God the Father sealed. Then said they unto him, What shall we do, that we might work the works of God? Jesus answered and said unto them, This is the work of God, that ye believe on him whom he hath sent. They said therefore unto him, What sign showest thou then, that we may see, and believe thee? What dost thou work? Our fathers did eat manna in the desert, as it is written, He gave them bread from heaven to eat. Then Jesus said unto them, Verily, verily, I say unto you, Moses gave you not that bread from heaven, but my Father giveth you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he which cometh down from heaven, and giveth life unto the world. Then said they unto him, Lord, evermore give us this bread. And Jesus said unto them, I am the bread of life. He that cometh to me shall never hunger, and he that believeth on me shall never thirst. The bread of life that saves us. Jesus. And he will keep us. He will keep us to the end. He will present us to the Father, blameless, perfect in his sight, and ready for our inheritance. We have such a wonderful Savior in Jesus Christ. So many wonderful things that we have. We have a love that can never be fathomed. A life that can never die. A righteousness that can never be tarnished. A peace that can never be understood. A rest that can never be disturbed. A joy that can never be diminished. A hope that can never be disappointed. A glory that can never be clouded. A light that can never be darkened. A happiness that can never be interrupted. A strength that can never be weakened. A purity that can never be defiled. A beauty that can never be marred. A wisdom that can never be baffled. And resources that can never be exhausted. When we put our faith and trust in the Lord Jesus, he will provide for our every need. He will provide for our every care, and he can take them away from us. As Brother Earl has pointed out this morning, we can trade him all of our cares, all of our woes, all of our worries, all of our doubts, and he presents us with grace. He presents us with mercy. He presents us with what we need.